Hello, world. Welcome to the Speed Strength Show. I'm Tommy.
I'm Braden. And what shape is a human?
Oh, I don't even know.
So, you might be thinking human shaped if you think about like a little gingerbread cutout or something like that.
Yeah, that doesn't
But
count. I feel like that's a cop out.
the reason I wanted to ask this question is because you can make the argument that we are something in the realm of a cylinder.
You think so?
We are hollow in a way.
Yeah, and the torso sort of is a like. Are we a series of cylinders?
I guess they do have doors in between. Like the sphincters are effectively like little doorways in between the hallways of our inner organs.
No, but I wasn't even just thinking about the organs, but I'm even thinking like if you like think about the way the arm or the leg is built, like they're round in the sense that you would need like a tape
Mm.
measure to measure the diameter of your leg or your arms.
Oh, I see. I see.
So everything does have a bit of a like a tapered cylindrical shape in that regard.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, you could definitely look at at the limbs and the torso probably as a bunch of individual cylinders. But yeah, I was coming at it from the perspective that like we have a garden hose essentially running like right through the middle of us, just snakes around a bunch.
I mean,
You
that is true
know.
in the sense that there's one open, there's a door in and a door out.
Yeah,
Like you're almost kind of like a donut in some way.
that was the other word that I wrote down.
Yeah, like you're
Was it?
sort of like a donut in the sense that
Yeah,
there's just a hole
like
with other stuff around it.
yeah, yeah. They're like yeah, it's like we've got. There's levels of separation, obviously. Like our it's not like we're paper thin. Like we have substance, but there's just a hole right down the middle.
Yeah, it's not as apparent as the donut. It's much more complex than that. But if you
Yeah.
really want to simplify it, it's all connected. Like you said, the garden
Mhm.
hose is you know,
We're a garden
man,
hose inside a bag of meat.
yeah, like so that's what I wasn't sure about because as soon as you were talking about shape, I was thinking about like a geometrical shape, and I was like,
Mhm.
okay, if there's a bunch of parts of the body that are sort of cylinder esque,
Mhm.
but when you said like, oh, we fit into a cylinder, I'm like, well, if the cylinder's big enough, you could fit into a box or a triangle or like other shapes and
Mhm.
geometric figures. But in that regard, yeah, I mean, it's usually a one-way street in that sense. Like,
It is usually a one-way street.
yeah,
That's true. In the case where yeah, something goes in one end and comes out the other end, like we talked a little bit about last week with Zach, but yeah,
oh, that was. At least I'm not laughing hysterically this time around.
you got your composure.
I mean, I think I did bet when I went back and listened to the audio recording. You can't hear me laughing,
Mm.
so
Yeah,
I
I
did
think
my
it.
best to try to like keep the mic really, really far away, so that way you wouldn't hear
Mm.
me laughing like a hyena.
Mm. I
But
think I think I always keep the mic real close when I'm laughing.
but dude, I was laughing for like a minute and a half straight. Like I didn't even contribute to the conversation for about a minute because I was just crying as we were as like that nonsense was going on. So at least at least this time it was like it was interesting, it was thought provoking.
Mhm.
But I'm not unable to contribute to the conversation because I'm just crying
Well,
from
that
laughing
would
hysterically.
be bad if that was the case with just the two of us.
Well, yeah, it worked last time because there was a third person to chip in,
Yeah,
but then it would just be you talking to yourself
yeah, I
as
don't
I'm
want to do
laughing.
that. I'm not good enough at conversation to talk to myself.
It would be a
So,
Braden soliloquy or an
yeah,
aside. I don't know what the difference is. I didn't pay enough attention to Shakespeare. Um,
yeah, I don't know either. I
But
don't know
either
what
way,
it's.
that's when one person is talking, but I don't know what
Sure, a monologue.
the technical difference is.
Yeah, that'd be
Someone with a
interesting. I don't
history, like an English degree, would probably be able to point me in the right direction,
know. Hmm.
point out the
I
difference.
honestly,
But I don't know.
I honestly don't really know why we still read Shakespeare.
I don't either.
Like I get the literary devices and stuff, but literary devices are everywhere. So
But yeah, why Shakespeare?
like it's old. Nobody understands it anymore.
And the stories kind of suck.
I
Like
don't
they're
know
not
the
very good.
stories. I don't know the stories well enough to say if they suck or not.
Did you not
I
have
did.
to read Shakespeare?
Oh, I did. I just didn't understand it. I just I just said
Well,
that.
yeah, that's why the stories sucked. You had no idea what was going on.
I think English was different back then. But yeah, I don't know. Like yeah, the English well, English was different back then. So we can't.
Well, we've talked about the English language on this intro. Like,
That's right.
what an adventure that is.
That's right. Um I I was applying. I was applying to write my Arcan, like to write the exam. Right, I told you about that.
Yes.
And in the application form, you have to write like what languages you speak and what languages you are able to practice in, like provide service in. Um, which makes sense. Like I thought there was going to be maybe a few. Like we're in Canada, so I was thinking it was going to be, you know, like English, French, obviously, and then some more popular like Spanish is a language in the States, like a main language in the States. So
Yeah, yeah.
things like that. And but obviously there's people from all over the world here, so major stuff I thought would be there. But Middle English was one of the options I could have chosen.
Pardon me.
Middle English, like from like the Middle Ages,
W-
and Old English was also something I could have chosen.
What's the difference between Old English and Middle English? It's all old now.
Well, it's all old now, but like I don't know where the dates cut off, but it's just like it changed as it evolved, right? And I don't know that much about it, but my brother has said that like you wouldn't if someone who spoke Old English was around today, like you wouldn't be able to understand them because the language is so different.
When? Wait, and this was for the Arcan,
Yeah,
which being a kinesiologist only became a profession like 15 years ago or something
apparently.
like that. Old
Yeah,
English was long gone before kin was ever even a thing.
yeah.
You have to ask about that. Like, I'm sure there's like an email or something where it's like, if you have questions about the forum, email. 100% you need to email them and be like, what's the deal with this Old English or Middle
Yeah, maybe
English?
maybe I will. But I was shocked, honestly, that like I've never seen that on any
That's so
like because you have
funny.
to you fill out like what language do you speak on like a lot of forms you have to fill that out.
Yeah.
But like I've never seen that as an option
I
ever.
wonder if you should select it and see if you have to write an Old English proficiency exam, like a literacy test to see if you actually know Old English or not,
That's kind of
or Middle
ironic.
English. Completely up to you.
Yeah, it's up to me. Probably that one. I think I'd have a better my current skills would transfer better to Middle English, I think. But that's kind of an ironic thing because I think when Middle English or Old English was a thing, most people couldn't read at all, and
No,
so
the literacy
uh,
rates were very low.
so literacy test would be moot at that point.
That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. That's so dumb that they even give those as options.
I think.
But I find it's you need to dig deeper into this.
All right.
Or if not, share the form with me and I'm going to email them pretending to be interested in taking the Arcan and I'm going to ask them about the Old and Middle English.
All right. Yeah.
That's too
I'll
funny.
I'll report back. I'll see if I can get an answer about that.
Oh, please do. I'm going to keep hounding you every episode. Be like, did you find out? Did you find out?
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I guess I mean, it's recorded. It's going to be on the internet, so the listeners can hound me too if they're curious.
Yes, everyone get on Braden. Remind him, politely, of course, that he
Politely.
needs to figure out what the deal is with this dead languages being relevant to the Arcan for whatever reason.
Yeah. I mean, maybe there's one person in the world that does speak Old English and that's it. and is looking desperately for a kinesiologist but can't find one. And I would hate to lie and say that I could, just to disappoint this poor person.
I mean, if it makes you feel any better, if there's anyone left in the world who speaks Old English or even Middle English, they probably don't live here. I imagine they live in some part of the UK where they don't even use electricity yet. So they're probably not even looking for an Arcan, to be perfectly honest. So I think you're probably all right.
I think probably if anyone still speaks Old English, they don't know what an Arcan is. They've never heard of that.
Yeah. So I think you'll be all right.
Yeah, that's fair.
And if something does go south, just blame it on me.
Okay. That's good. That's good. And you'll handle everything from there.
Correct. I'll explain everything to them.
Of course, because you also know Old English.
I dotheth speaketh. The eldest form of English. Done. Yeah. They would know exactly what I'm talking about.
There you go. Yeah, it might be a little bit more complicated than that. Anyway, after this convincing argument, I'm not 100% sold if I should reach out to them, being that it could be a major part of my career. So I don't know if I want to jeopardize that. This is a smooth transition into whether
I knew where you were going with this.
Yeah, I thought I had it solid, but I didn't. It didn't come together as cleanly as I thought it was going to. I think a lot of people are very firmly that you should do hypertrophy always. It's very important, or you should never do hypertrophy. It's scary. So we're talking about hypertrophy today.
Big topic.
It is a very big topic, and I guess potentially controversial. I didn't honestly really think about how controversial it could be until like earlier today, I think. But I do think it's important for us to start off with like who should be doing it, who should not be doing it, because I do think a lot of people are afraid of what it could mean.
Well, yeah, there's always caution because hypertrophy. You go, okay, is it a good or bad thing that I'm putting on more muscle mass? My muscles are getting larger. Is that going to make me stronger and more powerful and better at what I'm trying to do? Or is that just going to slow me down and make it more cumbersome? And I think you are right. It's very much it depends scenario. And I think that's what makes it so tricky and maybe why people tend to just stay hard on one side of the fence or the other, because it can potentially be a tricky thing to navigate, because you can potentially do too much of it and have some drawbacks, or not do enough of it and have some drawbacks. So if you stay on one extreme or the other, you might avoid that potentially.
Yeah, I do think probably more people, not necessarily athletes, but athletes I would say are involved in this camp, are more afraid that they'll do too much of it. Like I'm sure I've heard a lot of like some athletes, definitely some athletes, but more so like women that want to go to the gym that are afraid of getting bulky, looking like a man. I don't know how popular that opinion still is, but I've definitely heard it in the past. And I mean, like it's not like it's easy to put on a lot of muscle mass.
It's not easy. And I would agree with you. I think, yeah, the big debate probably revolves around the athletic population, because I think it is, like you talked about, it is very difficult to put on size. So if anyone in the general population is too concerned about getting like very large, it's probably not going to happen. And I think, when you look at the effects of aging and things like that, having a little bit of extra muscle mass is better than having not quite enough, because as you age, your muscle is going to deteriorate, the mass might disappear. And it's important for like healthy function on a day-to-day basis. right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's huge if you want to be walking around when you're, 90, climbing stairs, playing with grandkids or whatever. Like you need to be in the weight room doing like getting strong.
exactly. And so having a little bit of extra mass isn't going to impair you all that much or make it too cumbersome to climb stairs or things like that. But I think it's on the athletic side where if I have to run, how much extra mass helps me, how much extra mass holds me back. If I have to do something like swinging a baseball bat or a golf club, does having too much mass, does that impact my coordination? What's enough to help give me, pop behind hitting the ball or striking an opponent or striking a ball or something like that? And then what's so much mass that it holds me back and it makes me slower? So I think to me that's where the big question mark is how much hypertrophy should athletic populations do?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the most relevant to what we want to be talking about anyway. Um, but yeah, definitely there's concern in more of those like pure, like virtually pure speed sports. Like hitting a baseball is virtually a pure speed movement. Hitting a golf ball, same like tennis and all those kinds of where you're swinging something to hit something else is almost a pure speed movement. But even in sports like, I mean, basketball is contact-ish, hockey is contact-ish. You could argue that's collision.
I would put
Um,
hockey in the collision.
and like football and rugby are absolutely in the collision. And like the Super Bowl was just like a week and a half ago at the time of recording anyway. Um, and you look at like Tampa Bay's defense was amazing because they're so fast. Like they have so many players that can move really, and
Cover
they're
ground.
strong. They're big and strong, absolutely, but they're just so fast. They get sideline to sideline and they swarm. And like I think all sports are going more towards the route of smaller, faster, still strong, absolutely still strong, but smaller, faster, mobile players. I was telling you, I was just on a call with a guy that I used to work for, and he was talking about hockey players that are just afraid of putting on mass because they feel like they need to be small and fast and athletic, which is such a contrast to like hockey like 30 years ago where everyone just needed to be huge, like as big as you can be and strong as you can be, basically.
Well, and we even talked a little bit too off air before about like baseball. And if you look at the last 100 years, there was points where baseball players shouldn't lift. They're going to be too big. It's going to impact to their ability to hit the ball with the bat. To there was an era where the complete opposite, and everybody was juiced to the gills, and it was how big and strong can you be, and just crank the ball out of the park. And so I think like both these examples highlight well, do I do it? Do I not do it? How much is too much? And that's where the question marks kind of come up because it's it's not super clear in terms of you should do X amount of work to get larger and build more muscle, and then you're good. It's such a variable thing based on the sport and the athlete, and if you're even able to put on size. Look at the two of us. If you had to go do hypertrophy and put on some size, you'd have a much easier time than I would.
Mm. Yeah.
Right. So it even depends on the person. Are you able to put on more muscle mass?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point too. That's a good point too. Yeah, but with regards to the athletics, like it's definitely not a case of more is better. Um, there's definitely a middle ground where like too much, you're going to be big and slow. Depending on the sport, you might weigh more than your weight class,
Correct.
uh, allows for. And if you're too small, then maybe it's easier for other people to throw you around, regardless of how strong you are. Maybe you're injury prone because you don't have physical armor protecting your bones and joints. Or maybe you just can't, produce enough force. You don't have enough muscle mass to produce the force that is necessary for whatever the job you need to be doing is.
And that could even be like we're talking about speed, that could even be speed related activities,
Mhm.
right? You need enough force and enough pop to change direction, to sprint, to swing a baseball bat, to do these high velocity movements. So that's, yeah, it's a tricky middle ground for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, there is a point where there's a threshold where like doing more speed work won't make you faster because you just don't have the capacity to produce as much force to move faster. You know, I don't think that's a likely situation to get into, but it exists. You know,
I mean, certainly, like if you look at a developing athlete, right? Look at a high school kid who's maybe really skinny, and then they start to put on more size. They get stronger, they get faster, they're more powerful. Like everything just shoots up in terms of their ability. So muscle mass obviously helps you do these ballistic high speed activities. But then there's a point where you get too big and it slows you down and you need to be doing other things. So I think that's to the point where, like you said, doing too much is not good, but you need to do a certain amount.
Yeah, especially in that like that time period, that high school, like late high school period, young adulthood period is like prime time for building muscle. Like just after you hit puberty, your hormones are, like they allow for this kind of thing now. This is the most potent time probably for you to put on muscle mass. And so it'll never be easier than in that like 16 to 20-ish window. And that's arguably the time when you need it the most because just getting stronger, just getting a little bit more size will improve every athletic metric you can think about. and I mean, I remember you told me about some research a while ago, like that's the number one thing to improve like sport performance in like that young adult, late adolescent kind of thing is strength. If you're stronger, then you're a better athlete than everybody else in that age
Yeah,
group,
like the
generally
strength had the
speaking.
highest influence on a
Mhm.
bunch of those factors.
Mhm.
And then obviously, as you get older and performance becomes more um, like focused or pinpointed on one thing, then strength starts to play less and less of a role. And you need to get into the other forms of training that are more specific to the
Right.
demands of your sport. So, like you said, kind of take advantage of it while
Mhm.
you can. And then you save time later down the road to focus on other things that probably have more relevance in your
Yeah.
performance
Yeah.
overall.
You need enough still. And like you probably wouldn't, like if you want to be playing sport when you're 22, like you need to be good at that sport if you want to be playing competitively. And
Exactly.
you'd be, in my opinion, hard pressed to get to that point where focusing on the skills and focusing on the mental side of the game has a bigger impact than your athleticism if you never develop that athleticism.
It's going to hold you back somewhere.
Mhm.
So, and if you want to be at the top, you need to have all those variables in play,
Mhm.
right? The people who are at the top of their game don't really have any weak points. They're good at most of that stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean
So
in
you can't
any
leave anything
sport,
off the table.
in any sport, like it's not just the smartest player, the most technically sound player. Like they're freaks of nature as well that are at the
It's the
top of
whole
the sport.
package.
Yeah.
The whole package.
hmm So. hmm Um. Yeah. So I guess that's who should do it for the
Yeah, I
most
think we're
part.
both in agreement that, I mean, athletes, you do need to do at least a selective amount of hypertrophy work,
hmm
right?
And it's
You,
going to
you do
vary.
need to have enough muscle mass and enough size for your sport. And again, it's going to depend. A football player, like you said, football, rugby, a collision sport, probably does more hypertrophy work, relatively speaking, than someone who's in golf, for example,
hmm
or, you know, long jump or something like that. But both of those individuals are still going to need an adequate amount of muscle mass to do what they need to do.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
at some point in your athletic career, you're going to have to do some things to increase the amount of muscle mass that you have on your
hmm
body.
Yeah. Yeah. Generally, I guess I would say the athletes that are the their purpose in the sport is to move something that's heavy, you're going to need more muscle mass, generally speaking. If you're moving something that's light, less muscle mass, generally. Like it doesn't take a lot of force to get a golf club moving fast. It takes a lot of force to get an offensive lineman moving fast.
Correct.
If you are not that offensive lineman.
Yes, if you're another person trying to move that individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, so I've been reading a lot of research the last couple of days prepping for this one.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there.
Yeah, and I know you sent me some stuff as well, which was
Yeah.
appreciated.
I mean, I wasn't joking when I said it's literally a big topic. Like, there's a lot of things out there, and there's a lot of different ways you can like start to break it down and look at it.
Mm-hmm. And it's also from what I've read, it seems like it's not 100% conclusive as to what you actually need to be doing.
Yeah, it seems to be close.
Like everyone's in the same ballpark that like this seems to work better, but it's not 100%.
I think that's the nature of science, though. Nothing's ever going to be
that's right
100% because there's always going to be some study or some group of people that are looking at it a different way and producing something that maybe goes against that. But like I said, I just think there's so many aspects of the topic that it's like, where do you begin? Where do you start talking about this?
Yeah. Well, actually, so interesting question. I think what do you think is the number one thing that people listening to this will assume about hypertrophy and how to train for it?
I'll say two things. I think most people think about hypertrophy in terms of increasing the size of the muscle in terms of the cross-sectional area. So if you chop the muscle in half, increasing the diameter of that muscle. So if you were like using a measuring tape on your leg, I went around my thigh, it's 25 inches. Oh, and then 2 months later, I went around my thigh and it's now 26 inches. It's grown in diameter. Most people think of hypertrophy in terms of that. And most people probably just assume that if you want to do stuff like that, it's pop culture leads you towards bodybuilding. So you're probably going to look up what are some of the best bodybuilders in the world doing to increase muscle size and symmetry? Because that's probably the most popular means for people to figure out what should you do to maximize that trait in the public eye.
I think that's a good point actually that I think maybe is valuable to touch on before we get into the meat of it. Is that hypertrophy is literally just making the muscle bigger.
Simple as that.
And as we'll get into, but something that I learned, like there's multiple ways to make the muscle bigger. Like the muscle's not just one solid thing. Like it is and it isn't, but you can add.
It's a bundle of things.
It's a bundle of things. That's a good way to put it. And so you can make it, thicker. You can make it effectively longer. You can make it, like we'll probably clarify that later. Or you can make it kind of swollen is another aspect of hypertrophy, is that you're just literally like more fluid is now inside the muscle. So it's bigger. It's not necessarily stronger, but it's bigger.
Yeah, there's so many different all the things that are bundled up inside the muscle. Any of those things could grow or get larger.
Yeah.
So like you said, is it the actual muscle fiber that's getting larger? Is it the muscle just being swelled up with fluid? Is it increasing in length, diameter? It's basically just the muscle getting bigger is what it comes down to.
But yeah, I also think you're right that most people, if they're wanting hypertrophy, they're going to look towards bodybuilding and what are bodybuilders doing. I haven't been following bodybuilding really ever, honestly. I don't care about that stuff. But from what I understand about bodybuilding culture and what pop culture says about hypertrophy, it's high reps. And you want to feel the burn is probably the two main things that I think people are going to assume about it. But that's not necessarily the case.
No, and it's same on the flip side. If you look at like the NSCA textbook for the CSCS, and it gives you a defined rep range and load.
Yeah.
That it needs, I think it's, 60 to 75%, 8 to 12 reps, 2 to 4 sets, something like that. I don't have it memorized because it's not
Well,
that important, to be honest.
60 to 85% was the number that I kept seeing, and like the 6 to 12 rep range was, yeah. But I was like, who's doing like 85% for 6 reps is still like a
That's a
lot.
lot. Yeah, that's so I was going to say there's that aspect too, where anyone who's gone through a personal training course or a CSCS or some form of fitness certification has
Mhm.
probably seen somewhere this predetermined sets, reps, and load that you have to do in order to make the muscle grow larger. And if you go outside those parameters, then you're doing something different,
Mhm.
which most of the research shows that's probably not the case.
Well, yeah, one of the studies that you sent to me compared it was high and low reps, high intensity, low intensity, where I think the range in percentage was like 30 to 90%.
Yeah, big variance.
Um, and on the high rep range, I think it was 20 to 25. I don't remember what the low rep range was. Oh, I think maybe that was like the
Like
8 to
3 to 5
12.
or whatever.
Oh, was it that low?
There was some that were, yeah, there was, because it's like 90%.
Why? And I remember it surprised me. I was like, who's doing 90% for 8 reps or whatever? Like that's
Yeah,
so
like
much. But that one was interesting. And the key variable there seemed to be training to failure or close to failure, at least.
exactly. Well, and it was really cool because they were doing the muscle biopsies as well, right? Where they were like taking out a part of the muscle,
Hmm.
like the microscopic part with the needle. So that way you could see the change in like the muscle properties as well. So not only did both those groups experience hypertrophy and get larger because they went to failure, but the hypertrophy wasn't any different when they compared the muscle samples. It wasn't like, oh, the people who did low reps, had an increase in fast twitch fibers, but not slow twitch. And the people who did a lot of reps had it the other way around. The muscle grew larger, I guess, in the best way to describe it, to the same quality,
Hmm.
regardless of which loading parameter they picked, which is
Hmm.
why I think in the title of the study, it says something like neither load or volume determines like
Yeah.
the effects of hypertrophy. Because in this case, it was, like you mentioned, going to failure or close to failure.
Yeah, that was something that was interesting for me to learn in the research because I remember, um, well, back in the Waterloo days, whenever those were, and you ran your maximal eccentric uh,
Oh,
training program for hypertrophy. I remember at the time the goal was type 2 hypertrophy. I remember you saying that. Um, so then I had it in my head that like there's certain things you want to be doing to hypertrophy type 2 and certain things you want to be doing to hypertrophy type 1, which inherently makes some sense. Um,
it's not necessarily the case, though.
well, it seems that like any resistance training, like if you're doing hypertrophy, it's like hypertrophy through weight training. You're going to be doing mostly type 2 hypertrophy. Like they're the most susceptible, I guess,
Yeah,
to
those fibers
hypertrophy.
will grow larger
Yeah,
than a
like
type 2.
you're gonna get
Or, sorry,
both.
type 1.
Yeah, you're gonna get both if you do enough of it. But it seems like the type 2 happens earlier, happens faster, happens to a larger degree than the type 1 fibers, regardless of like the rep scheme or the loading scheme or whatever.
Yeah, and the cool thing that I took away from that, like you said, obviously at the time, a little bit of a different thought process. I mean, it worked. I did put on size, which
I know
was the goal,
it was based on evidence at the time. I remember. So
but it made sense because I was going to failure. So it sort of lines up. But the thing that has sort of now opened my eyes as to doing that, even though like conceptually, I was probably incorrect with what I was doing, because now this type of research would show sort of otherwise, that you can't necessarily selectively hypertrophy certain muscles over the other, um, or types of muscles. If you obviously don't work a muscle, it's not going to grow larger. Um, but was that you have far more variance now if you wanted to run a block of hypertrophy or focus on making someone have more muscle mass. You're not trapped within the box or the confines of X amount of reps, X amount of sets, this amount of load. Because one thing that I found really helpful with that was now going into a max strength program or a block, your body's better prepared for those heavier loads. Because traditionally, when you go from the hypertrophy to the max strength, it's a big jump in load in terms of percentage. You're working somewhere probably 65 to 70% of your max. And now you're starting to climb 80, 85, 90, like 95. And it's a big jump in weight is where doing the hypertrophy with heavier weight, if you're doing it with 75 to 85 or something like that, or even heavier potentially, it made it a lot easier for the body to adapt to the heavy loads, which in my case, it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And especially like I obviously deal mostly with powerlifters right now. So that being accustomed to heavy load thing matters quite a bit. And if you're dealing with like a pretty short turnaround between meets or something and you want to get a little hypertrophy in, maybe, I don't know, like we'll probably touch on some research later that shows how quickly hypertrophy actually happens. Um, but you don't want to have to jump from, yeah, like a hypertrophy phase where you're dealing with like 65% load with like 15 reps or something like that. And then the next block, you want to get in some serious strength work. So you're jumping to 85% for like sets of 5 and then into a peaking phase. Like that's drastic, and you're not preparing the body for that kind of thing. So it is helpful to be able to do these kinds of things at heavier weights or lighter weights, depending on, what kind of a situation you're in. And even just if maybe you're in an off season and you want to focus like 3 or 4 blocks in a row on hypertrophy, or maybe you're a bodybuilder and you're doing hypertrophy all the time, it's going to be harder, I think. And you were going to touch on this because you got something interesting out of Arnold's book.
Yeah.
But it's hard to, you can't, it's really hard to continue to progress at the same rate or a similar rate if you're doing similar stuff all the time.
Yeah, if you're doing the same stuff.
So if the NSCA textbook says, 4 sets, 8 to 12 reps between, 65 and 85%. Like if you're doing that all the time at a certain point, it's like, and 6 reps at 85% is different than 12 reps at 65%. But at a certain point, a novel stimulus is going to be a little bit more helpful.
Yeah, you just become so stagnated, right? Your body adapts. Your body adapts, it figures out how to do that. And then it goes, I don't need to build any more muscle mass. Because that's ultimately the response from the failure, right? Is that you use resistance training, bringing the muscle to failure. And the muscles basically go, oh, we're not capable of doing this. Well, okay, I guess we're going to have to build more muscle in order to produce more force to be able to do this. But if you keep loading it the same way over and over and over again, your body's going to get to a point where it goes, okay, we have the muscle mass to do this. We don't need to make any changes. And if you are trying to get larger, if you are trying to build more muscle, it doesn't really help. And that was something that was really interesting that came up in, as you mentioned, like Arnold's book. He had an autobiography that came out, I think, within the last couple of years. I think it's an autobiography. It's whatever story that you write about yourself. So if I'm wrong, somebody let me know, and then I'll use the right term from now on.
The English majors.
Correct. Anyone who speaks Middle English, let me know. But he documents the story of his life. And so obviously a large chunk of the book talks about his bodybuilding career, where he was like a bazillion time Mr. Olympia and basically the greatest bodybuilder of all time. And it was interesting because he documented how, like you said, the pump, the burn, going to failure was like an important part of building muscle mass. But he recognized that you couldn't just do that all the time. And so he writes about like when he was, I still think, living in Austria, he was like working with a weightlifting coach on like snatch and clean. And by the time he got to California, he was still using some of that stuff. He had been talking to powerlifting coaches because he recognized, sort of like what we've talked about, if you just keep using the same stimulus over and over and over again, eventually your body's not going to respond. And he obviously, in his sport of bodybuilding, had to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's how he was gonna win. And so he recognized where he's like, oh, I can do some of this bodybuilding stuff, but then I can learn about powerlifting and get stronger in like bench, dead, squat. And he's like, now I have more strength and output in the muscles to then come back and do more failure work at a new level that I wasn't at before.
Mhm.
And so now I don't know how good he was in terms of, like, obviously a lot of his training probably went undocumented in terms of video footage. So I don't know what the quality of his squats looked like. I don't know what the quality of his weightlifting looked like. Who knows? But it was an interesting concept where he was intertwining these other strength sports into his bodybuilding because he recognized that that was going to help him jump through those plateaus in terms of getting larger. And it was just an interesting concept because if I'm thinking like someone in a speed power sport, like within track and field, you're probably doing very limited hypertrophy work. But a rugby player, a football player, maybe a hockey player, someone in a collision sport, if you have to run multiple blocks of hypertrophy, is that maybe a way to work it? Do you intertwine it with some of these other abilities and skills that you inherently need in these sports? Because it's not just about muscle size. You need strength, you need force output, you need rate of force development, other things like that. So it's just a really interesting concept. And that's probably one of the reasons he was so good at bodybuilding, whatever that means. Right?
Hmm.
Relative to his competition, because they were probably just doing the same bodybuilding failure stuff over and over again, as where he had a way to do it in a unique way, which,
Mhm.
I mean, the titles speak for themselves. He was a lot better than most people.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I wasn't expecting that to be. I wasn't really expecting that to be the answer. Um, but it makes a lot of sense. Like, I guess maybe another thing we should have said off the top is muscle strength is generally defined by cross-sectional area times the number of fibers that are activated. And then obviously what goes into how much weight you can lift. There's going to be coordination and leverages and insertion points and synergy and all that sort of stuff. But it's
Well, and that's why people do hypertrophy work.
yeah,
Because, like you said, if
more.
they figure more cross sectional area, more force,
Mhm,
and then more force turns into better whatever activity you're doing.
mhm. But the other thing is the recruitment. Recruiting more muscle fibers means more force as well, and that's really interesting to recognize that. Um, Going into a sport where you're not going after the hypertrophy elements, you're going after the more neural elements. How can I optimize the lifts to be able to use more weight? How can I teach my body to be more efficient and to develop better neural pathways so I can recruit more motor units? It's a different thing than hypertrophy and building muscle to teach your body how to recruit more motor units. But it's absolutely, like, it makes so much sense to do, because then you're going to be using those like more motor units earlier in each movement, that like in each failure set that you're going to do later after you've accomplished whatever you needed to accomplish, taking a break. You're going to be using more motor units earlier in all of those movements, and they're going to be exposed to more stress and all that sort of stuff. um and I don't, it makes sense, but some of the other literature that I was reading was talking about how if you're taking the muscle to failure, at least at the end of the set, you're using all of the motor units, all of the motor units you have access to anyway. I guess you won't be using all of them, because if you're, an untrained individual, you can't just maximally contract your muscle.
Yeah, your recruitment's not good enough.
Yeah. So yeah, it does definitely make a lot more sense to refine that neural pathway for sure.
Well, and again, that makes sense with some of the research. Again, even with whether you lifted a small amount of load several times or a really heavy load only a few times, eventually, if you go to failure, I mean, we've probably all done exercises before where, meathead style, you do some sort of like bench pyramid scheme. And then all of a sudden, your last set is with just the bar and you can only get like 4 reps because you started at heavy weight and you just continually did like a drop set or something.
Mm.
And even a very light load feels very heavy if you do enough work.
Mm-hmm.
So from a recruitment standpoint, yeah, you're now tapping into the strongest possible fibers that are left.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, that would line up with this idea that going to failure is maybe the most important element in creating hypertrophy
Mm-hmm.
compared to how heavy the load is or how many reps you do or whatever. Because you can create failure via resistance training a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that was something just yeah, like the load doesn't matter that much. The number of reps doesn't matter that much. From that paper anyway, it was going to failure is important. And as long as you're doing the same number of sets to failure, it's fine. Because that was something, if anyone is looking to go do some of the research, probably something that you're going to find is high reps work better, depending on where you're looking. High reps work better if you equate total volume, I think, or maybe low reps work better if you equate. I can't remember which way it goes. But if you equate total volume, you're going to have to be doing less sets to failure of one and more sets to failure of another one, which is going to mean whichever one you have to do more sets of failure to, that's going to go better. So it's potentially a skewed result, a skewed interpretation.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I mean, one of the other things I had written down, and this is purely anecdotally through personal experience and people I've worked with, um, like there's a lot of places where, like, when I started running track and like completely switched over and was committed to track, there were like my calves started to get bigger, hip flexors, like there were certain select areas of the body that started to get larger, but I wasn't necessarily doing hypertrophy work on those areas. And so, and I've seen it with other people in sport where you're not really working on hypertrophy, but they tend to get bigger in certain aspects, or maybe someone from an occupation. And so there's something with repetition that I think plays a role with how often you use a certain pattern, that the body goes, okay, this is a pattern we frequently use. These are the muscles that are involved. We should make them a little bit larger so they're stronger, which would sort of line up with the idea you're talking about with the equating the volume, that whichever one had more sets could potentially be more effective because you're doing more repetitions or cycles of the work. So I don't know if there's like research on that. It was more just a point that I'd put down because the repetition or the frequency of doing stuff very often, I've found anyway, does tend to contribute to selective hypertrophy in the sense that the muscles that are being used in those movements tend to grow larger.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like I, I don't know what kind of research has been done on that. Most of the stuff that I found was like relatively short term, being less than a year. But I have noticed that myself. I remember when I switched from squatting in heels predominantly to squatting in flats predominantly, or squatting barefoot predominantly, that I felt anyway my calves got bigger from doing that and just having more, like my feet were asked to do more. Um, but I
But
mean,
it's
if
not
you
like you
look at,
did specific work to say, I want to make my calves larger.
I
It
didn't do any
just,
calf work. No, absolutely
it was
not.
a
But like, I mean,
byproduct.
exactly. And squats do use your calves to an extent. Um, but yeah, that was something that was interesting for me to notice. But I mean, you look at anybody, any professional really, like if you look at mechanics or like carpenters or anything, like their hands are massive
Yeah.
because they're just holding and squeezing, and like so much force is going through their hands all the time, every day for 40 years or whatever. So absolutely, it makes sense, and like it supports like the stuff we were talking about with Zach the last couple episodes, where your body adapts to movements, adapts to positions, and we've mentioned that a bunch. It doesn't matter if you want the body to adapt to these ones or not. It doesn't matter if it's training or not. It's
It
going to
doesn't know
happen.
the difference.
Yeah.
It doesn't know if you're picking up a heavy boulder because you're working a landscaping job or if you're picking up a heavy stone in a strongman competition.
Yeah.
It just knows, oh,
Exactly.
this is something that weighs X amount and we got to move it.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's just an interesting thing because like we're talking about, should you do hypertrophy? Should you not do hypertrophy? There's probably an amount of hypertrophy you get just by doing other things in the weight room and other things in your sport and in your training, where maybe some people don't need to do hypertrophy work because they get the necessary work through the things you're already programming.
Yeah, well, that's it, and it depends. Like, yeah, it really just depends on the level that you're at. But that was like another thing that was consistently coming up in the research is from a hypertrophy standpoint. As long as you're doing weight training, hypertrophy is going to happen. It doesn't really matter what the specific stimulus is. As long as there is a stimulus, hypertrophy will happen. There's ways to optimize that. There's certain things that have a stronger influence and a weaker influence. But yeah, if you're in the weight room, you are experiencing hypertrophy. If you're not in the weight room, you might still be experiencing hypertrophy. And I mean, realistically, like it is kind of happening all the time because like the proteins in your muscles are constantly getting turned over and recycled and stuff like that. So to an extent, it's always happening.
Yeah. And so, well, and I think that's again, like on the other side of the argument where maybe you don't have to do hypertrophy because maybe you're going into the weight room to do some rate of force development work or strength work. And maybe that's going to give you all the hypertrophy you actually need. So you don't need to take the time and do an unnecessary amount of work or focus on that because it might get you like what's big enough for your sport and it might get you there. So again, that's why to me it's such a fascinating topic. Um, and again, that's just more from anecdotal seeing people I've worked with, the changes I've noticed as I've changed training and not intentionally, like an unintended change. And so it's, I think it plays a factor. I just don't exactly know how it plays a factor, compared to some of the other stuff that's been looked at empirically in terms of research papers and evidence and things like that.
Yeah, but I mean that's a really good point though. I don't know if like if you look at how you've obviously been a strength coach for court sports mostly, I think, right, and track coach,
Before,
court
yeah,
sports
so it
and
was
track.
mostly with court sports and then with track and field.
Yeah, and working with those court sports anyway was a far different weight room atmosphere from my perspective than what I experienced with football, um, where you're going to have outliers on every team, but for the most part in the football atmosphere, everyone wants to lift heavy all the time. Everyone wants to lift a failure all the time. No reps in the tank, leave everything in the weight room, whatever, all that kind of nonsense,
And
which,
everyone wants to get big.
yeah.
Like it's
And
a
I
sport predicated on size to some extent.
exactly. So I don't think that's necessary all the time, but knowing that that's the culture and knowing that's generally what the people are going to be doing if you're not supervising them constantly in that situation, maybe you don't need a dedicated hypertrophy block because like if it's taken to failure, that means hypertrophy is happening to a large extent, then you've done it. You don't need to have a specific block dedicated to that. Max strength is hypertrophy, max power stuff is hypertrophy to an extent,
Because you've
you know.
just done everything, you've gone CrossFit on it and just done everything to failure.
Yeah. You probably want blocks dedicated to movement patterns for younger athletes, um, but maybe you don't necessarily need a dedicated hypertrophy block, which is something that I hadn't thought about, honestly. So,
And even in
um,
sports where you're concerned, like it might work on both ends. Like you talked about with football, where people want to get bigger, want to get stronger in terms of physical size. But I've seen this method used in track and field where people don't necessarily want to get larger than they need to be.
mm,
So by taking that approach of just, okay, we'll lift heavy, we'll move some lighter things fast, we'll do what we think is important. And whatever hypertrophy happens is happening because it's important for us to do those things. So you're kind of almost getting the necessary hypertrophy, but not excessive.
mm,
You're
yeah,
basically just letting it happen as a byproduct. And it's like, well, if I need to lift a heavy enough weight, I do need this extra hypertrophy. Or if I want to move this load fast enough, I need a little bit of the extra muscle mass. But we
mm,
know the body is reluctant to produce more muscle mass than it needs to
hmm,
because it's so taxing that it's almost a way you can just let the body create what muscle it actually needs, and it
Mhm.
won't necessarily create more than what it needs, because that's a waste of energy.
Mhm. Yeah, that's an
So
interesting point. That's an interesting point for sure. And I guess it can help you from a coaching standpoint in that it might be really hard to sell track and field athletes on this is a hypertrophy block. This block is dedicated specifically to growing muscle. Whereas if you just say this is, it's like a modified, it's strength and power generally, like max strength and power stuff. Um, and you know that hypertrophy is going to happen because you programmed one set to failure, but
no one
or
else is
maybe you
alive
didn't,
into it.
whatever. Exactly. So it can help from that standpoint as well. Well, we're almost at the end of the episode, and I have a lot more of this on my paper to talk about.
Yeah, I'm excited. Like we talked a little bit at the start about hypertrophy occurs in so many different ways, and we sort of touched on just some of the stuff in terms of improving the cross-sectional area.
Mhm.
And I'm sure there's more that we can talk about that. We didn't even get into how you can change the muscle in terms of length
Mhm.
with some selective hypertrophy work. So, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff, I think, to talk about
Yeah, and
in
at
a
least
two-parter.
from the research that I found, there's a lot more, not just taking the muscle to failure, but other things that can augment the hypertrophy process. So, yeah, this is two, maybe three.
Yeah. Well, this is a good
Parts.
primer anyway to consider what athletes you're working with, what clients you're working with, what are your people that you're working with need to do, and
Yeah.
is hypertrophy relevant or not?
Mhm.
And
Well, and I think we dispelled some of the myths too. Like the rep range doesn't matter that much. The weight doesn't matter that much.
yeah,
You
there's
don't
other
need
factors that are arguably more important,
Yeah, definitely.
and I think
Definitely.
that's good to share with people too.
And it's also helpful just sometimes to have a reminder that I think the body's always adapting. It's always doing stuff. You don't need to have a dedicated, this is when we're doing this thing program or like block of your program, because like, it's not like if you decide I'm not going to have a hypertrophy block, that hypertrophy is not going to happen. That's not the case.
Yeah, the body doesn't hear you or see what you wrote on the paper. Oh, they wrote a hypertrophy block. Oh, okay, we better start getting bigger.
Yeah.
Oh, they didn't write hypertrophy on the sheet. Well, not going to get bigger now because you obviously don't want me to get bigger.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like if you did decide to do a hypertrophy block, that hypertrophy is only happening in that block. It's going to happen always. It's always happening.
Yeah, I mean, if it were that simple, then you would just write down whatever goal you wanted on the piece of paper, and your body would do it. I want to bench 1,000 pounds. Done, and I would bench 1,000 pounds because my
Yeah,
body would know that's what we need to do.
yeah. This is the 1,000-pound benching block, and then next week is going to be the 2,000-pound squatting block.
Yeah, it doesn't work like that. If it were only that simple.
Yeah, that would be nice. It would be whoever has the best penmanship is the best coach at that
Correct.
point.
Yeah.
Who's the best spelling? um, well, yeah. I mean, I'm super pumped to keep talking about this stuff next time.
Yeah, I'm stoked.
Um, I imagine you're also pretty jazzed to talk about. Actually, I don't know how jazzed you are about talking about the music from this, because we recorded very recently.
We did, but I'm always listening to just a whole bunch of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So there's
So,
always something that's got me.
what's got you this time?
I mean, some more typical kind of synth wave type stuff. I love it, but there's some of those songs with like that like 80s feel to it. Like the song was written 2 years ago, but it sounds like it's from the 80s.
Mm.
Is just like, to me anyways, like super, super cool. So um, there's a lot of stuff by Time Cop 1983, who's a synth
I know that
wave,
one.
like a synth pop artist.
Mm.
A lot of really, really good stuff from them that I've been listening to. And then another Canadian artist, and I might be pronouncing this wrong. It's either Mecca Mako or Mecca Maiko. I don't know how to pronounce the last. It could be May or whatever. But she's like a synth pop wave artist, and all her stuff sounds like it's from like the late 80s, early 90s. And so I've been doing a lot of computer work. So it's really nice, just kind of background music to like limited lyrics, just kind of noise.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's like stepping into a time machine.
Nice.
I wasn't around in the 80s, but I imagine that's what stuff sounded like in the 80s.
Yeah, that's cool. Is all of the synthwave stuff you listen to like English?
Yeah,
Yeah, cool. Okay.
most of the lyrics. I mean, unless you count like robot talk as a different, but the robots talk in English. If it's
Yeah.
like, like Daft Punk does like the electronic voices, stuff
Okay.
like that. Like
That's cool.
it's mostly in English, even if the artists are like, I guess, natives, like English speakers or not.
Mm-hmm.
Like Time Cop 1983, I think they're Dutch. So
That sounds correct. I imagine there's a lot of like when I think of synthwave, I think of like a Scandinavian
like the
nightclubs.
discotheque.
Yeah, stuff like that. Like German, like amps, like yeah, the
Yeah.
Netherlands, stuff like Northern Europe stuff. And like the first one that I thought of, a band, I don't remember what they're called, but I listened to a few of their songs in high school. The only song I remember the name was Strobo Pop, which apparently doesn't mean anything in German, but it's a German band that does pop stuff, and I liked how they sounded at the time. Um,
There's a lot
but
of Japanese artists too in that
mm,
like synthwave outrun type of. I mean, it's a pretty global genre of music,
yeah,
but it's usually in English.
that sounds correct. That sounds yeah. Even like this German group had like some of their lyrics were in English, so yeah.
I imagine for you, not much has changed because we
Not much has
recorded like
changed.
3 days ago.
Not much has changed. That's correct. But I will say something new. I've still
Spotify.
been because Spotify. That's right. Like this happened before the last recording, but I'll
Yes.
say it anyway. Off of the sea shanties playlists and stuff, I got introduced to a little bit of like there's some Irish folk stuff and some Celtic punk, which the Celtic punk was
Oh,
interesting.
that would be
I'm
good.
I want to explore a little bit more of that. The first couple songs that I heard, I didn't like as much as I thought I was going to. But I do really like the Dropkick Murphys,
Punk is
which,
generally a fun genre.
yeah, yeah. But I never really got into punk like Sum 41 and Blink 182. Like those are punk bands generally, right? Like I never really
Yeah, it's
got
like
into
pop
that.
punk.
Okay. I guess Billy Talent would be punk adjacent as well.
Yeah, I'd put them in
Um,
the pop punk category.
Okay. So I didn't, yeah, that was really the only punk ish band that I ever listened to. But I do really like the Dropkick Murphys, which I imagine is not that dissimilar to Celtic punk um, or Celtic rock. I don't really know, but I want to explore a little bit more into that and see where that goes. But I can also recommend sleep shanties. Bronwyn introduced me to sleep shanties, which is popular sea shanties, but the tempo and like everything about it is just lower, so it's more soothing.
It's like a lullaby.
Yeah, it's literally like you go to sleep listening to this. She has the Calm app that then has sleep stories and sleep music and things like that. So that was
Interesting.
entertaining. Yeah.
I definitely feel like I'm going to be on a punk kick now for 100% now. What I'm listening to share with people for the next episode is going to be punk for sure.
Now that I've brought it up.
It's like a forgotten genre for me sometimes.
Yeah, that
But punk
happens.
is a lot of fun. It's so all of something different for next week then. So thank you
All
for
right.
that.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. And well, otherwise next week we'll have more of the same hypertrophy, but new. Not the same stuff we said today. We'll have different stuff to say, but about hypertrophy.
Yeah,
as
get
well.
into the details.
Yeah.
The really exciting stuff.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, if you over the next few episodes have any questions about the stuff that we talked about and want resources, just hit us up on Instagram, Speed Strength Show, Speed Strength Performance. Braden Southern. And we can share papers or a condensed summary of what happened. I don't know. We'll see. Whatever you want to say. Yeah, just let us know. Yeah, and that was the Speed Strength Show. Thanks for coming along, world.
We will see you next time.
Peace.